A group of archaeologists have resumed the search for the 2,000-year-old Dead Sea Scroll and stumble upon the manuscripts before antique robbers get to them.
For 70 years, everyone asked the Dead Sea Scrolls the same question. What do they say? Nobody thought to ask what they were made of. Then a scientist pulled ancient DNA from dust at the bottom of a storage box, ran the sequence, and froze. Because the animal whose skin became that scroll could not have lived anywhere near the desert cave where it was found. Not the climate, not the region, nothing fit.
The Dead Sea Scrolls help in enhancing our knowledge of Judaism and Christianity. They present a non-rabbinic form of Judaism and show Christianity.
That single strand of genetic code was hiding a secret 70 years of scholars never saw coming. And it's about to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the Bible. A stone thrown into the dark. To understand why, go back to where it started. In 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd was chasing a lost goat across the rocky slopes near the Dead Sea. He reached the mouth of a cave and tossed a stone inside just to see if the animal might bolt out. Instead, he heard something shatter deep in the dark. He climbed in and found ancient clay jars, sealed for centuries, holding leather scrolls wrapped in linen. He had no idea what he'd found. What that shepherd found would become the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Between 1947 and 1956, roughly 25,000 fragments were pulled from 11 caves near the ruins of Qumran, close to 1,000 separate manuscripts. The earliest known copies of Genesis, Isaiah, and Psalms, alongside sectarian rulebooks, hymns, and dark visions of the Apocalypse, spanning from around 250 BCE to 68 CE, the most volatile stretch in the history of both Judaism and the earliest Christian movement. And here's the thing, when scholars opened these scrolls, they didn't hand over answers. They handed over questions. Where had they come from? Who wrote them? Why hidden in this one corner of the wilderness? For the next 70 years, everyone was sure they had it figured out. They were wrong. The theory that held for decades. For decades, researchers worked with nothing but their eyes and instincts, comparing handwriting and cross-referencing language, theology, and calendar systems for any pattern. And the answer they landed on pointed to the Essenes, described by ancient historians like Josephus and Pliny the Elder as a secluded monastic Jewish community in the Judean wilderness, devoted to purity, scripture copying, and divine judgment on a corrupt world. The ruins at Qumran sat right beside the caves and looked exactly like that settlement. It all fit almost too neatly. The sectarian texts described a community with its own laws and a solar calendar that broke from the lunar one the priests kept in Jerusalem. The War Scroll, a final showdown between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness, read exactly like something a breakaway sect would write. So the conclusion felt airtight. The Essenes lived at Qumran, copied their scripture there, and when Rome crushed the Jewish revolt in 68 CE, they buried their library in the caves for safekeeping. For decades, that was the story. The Dead Sea Scrolls were one desert sect's private collection. Case closed. Except, everything you just heard is about to come apart at the seams. Cracks nobody could close. Because underneath that tidy theory, uncomfortable details kept surfacing that the tools of the time couldn't resolve. The scrolls showed wild variation. Different versions of the same book side by side. Different scripts, different hands, expertly prepared skins next to rough, amateurish material in the same cave. And when radiocarbon dating was applied in the early 1990s, some scrolls turned out to predate the Qumran settlement itself. The chronology didn't add up. Then there's the deepest puzzle. Why would a single tightly disciplined sect keep multiple contradictory versions of its own sacred texts? Two entirely different editions of the Book of Jeremiah, one substantially longer than the other, inside a community supposedly built on rigid uniformity. A few scholars floated alternatives, but none had the evidence to topple a theory that had held for generations. And then the challenge came from a direction nobody expected. Not an archaeologist, not a theologian, a geneticist over lunch. If you want to see exactly how one scientist's offhand question unravels 70 years of certainty, subscribe now, because this is where the whole story turns. The lunch that changed everything. In 2012, at a table in Tel Aviv University, Molecular biologist Oded Richavi sat down with biblical scholar Noam Mizrahi, and the conversation drifted toward the Dead Sea Scrolls, toward the difficulty of matching thousands of tiny disconnected fragments. Mizrahi laid it out plainly: 25,000 fragments. No titles, no page numbers, no way to connect one piece of parchment to another beyond comparing handwriting and guessing at how old the skin looked. Subjective, imprecise, capable of being catastrophically wrong without anyone realizing it. Richavi listened. Then he asked a simple question. What are the scrolls actually made of? Parchment, Mizrahi said. Animal skin. Richavi paused. Parchment, he said, has DNA. And that one sentence cracked open a field nobody had thought to pursue. Richavi specialized in ancient DNA, a method that had already rewritten human prehistory. Nobody had pointed it at scripture. With Penina Shore, curator of the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Israel Antiquities Authority, he and Mizrahi built a small team to chase something no one had ever attempted. And what they found unsettled even the people who'd spent their careers protecting these texts. Reading genetics without a touch. And right away they hit a wall. The scrolls are sacred to multiple faiths and irreplaceable. Cutting or removing samples was off the table. So, how do you read the genetic history of something you're forbidden to touch? The answer had been hiding in plain sight. Inside the storage boxes, decades of handling had left behind fine particles of parchment dust at the bottom of the containers. That dust held collagen, the structural protein in animal skin, and locked inside it, preserved across 2,000 years, was ancient genetic material. By gathering dust from blank margins and worn edges, places no writing had ever touched, the team could collect what they needed without going near the ink. But turning that dust into usable sequences was brutal. Making parchment damages DNA, the iron-based inks were corrosive, and the scrolls had spent 2,000 years in caves before being handled by hundreds of researchers, each a possible source of modern contamination. So the team worked in cleanroom facilities, hunting for the molecular decay that only builds across centuries and cross-checking results between separate labs. It took years and hundreds of samples. But eventually they had reliable sequences from dozens of fragments. And when Richavi sat down with what those sequences showed him, everything stopped. The cow that broke the theory. Most fragments came back as expected. Sheepskin, the standard material across ancient Judea, from an animal built to survive a harsh desert. But a handful came back as something else. Something that shouldn't have been possible. Cowhide. Mizrahi sat with that in silence. Because cow parchment at Qumran wasn't just an oddity to footnote, it was geographically impossible. Qumran sits in the Judean desert beside the Dead Sea, one of the driest environments on Earth. Sheep and goats survive there, cattle cannot. A single cow needs dozens of gallons of water a day and real grazing pasture. No community at Qumran could have raised cattle nearby. Cow parchment could not have been made in that desert, which meant any scroll on cowhide had come from somewhere else entirely, somewhere with real water and grassland. The theory was not slightly off. It was wrong. Wrong in a way one single cow made undeniable. When the finding reached Nina Shore, she read it twice, slowly, to be sure she'd understood it. This didn't just threaten the Essene theory, it threatened the entire framework for what the Dead Sea Scrolls even were. And the cowhide wasn't scattered at random. It clustered around specific texts, specific versions of specific books, which is where the genetics get stranger still. Fingerprints inside the parchment. Here's what the team could suddenly do. By comparing genetic markers, they could tell whether two fragments came from the same individual animal. Two pieces from one sheep carry nearly identical mitochondrial DNA. Two pieces from different sheep don't. For 70 years, matching fragments had been guesswork. Now there was hard evidence, actual fingerprints written into the material itself. Take the book of Jeremiah. Two dramatically different versions survive among the scrolls. One looks like the Hebrew Bible read today, longer, chapters in the standard order. The other is shorter, missing entire sections, chapters rearranged. For decades, experts argued over what that meant. An early draft, a later revision, a scribal slip. The DNA gave a physical answer. The shorter Jeremiah was written on cowhide, the longer one on sheepskin, Different animals, almost certainly different regions. Not variant copies drifting apart from one original, but two separate textual traditions developed independently in two different communities in two different parts of ancient Judea. Two communities, two Bibles, side by side. They ran the same analysis on the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice, a liturgical text describing angelic worship in the heavenly temple, with copies found at both Qumran and Masada. Multiple Qumran fragments of that single text came from entirely different animals. This wasn't the guarded property of one isolated sect. It was widely copied, produced independently in multiple places. Then came the kinship analysis. Nuclear DNA markers let researchers spot parchments made from closely related animals, siblings, members of the same flock. Those clusters pointed to specific production centers, where several scrolls were made from local skins in a narrow window of time. And here's the detail that mattered most. Some of those tight family clusters turned up mixed in among fragments with no genetic relationship at all, from entirely different flocks. So, if this collection didn't grow out of one central scriptorium, where did all these scrolls come from, and who kept carrying them into a cave in the desert? A world of many voices. Think about what the diversity is telling you. If these scrolls came from one isolated sect, their sheer variety makes almost no sense. Why would a single disciplined community preserve competing versions of its own scripture and keep texts pushing positions it rejected instead of destroying them? But flip it around. If the collection was gathered from many communities across ancient Judea, brought to these caves over decades, and finally sealed away by one catastrophic crisis, then it all falls into place. The diversity isn't a problem to explain away, it's the whole point. And the genetics backed up something a few scholars had long suspected but could never prove, that these caves may well have functioned as a geniza, a sacred storage site, where Jews from many communities brought texts too holy to destroy but no longer usable in worship. Jewish law forbids discarding any document bearing the divine name, so such texts must be respectfully preserved instead. And the geography fits. Jerusalem sits barely 20 miles from Qumran. When Rome laid siege to the city between 68 and 70 CE, the Jews fleeing that destruction may well have carried whatever sacred scrolls they could rescue out into the desert, adding them to a collection other communities had quite possibly been depositing there for generations. But if that's true, if these caves held the sacred library of an entire people rather than one sect, then what does that do to the world we thought gave rise to Christianity itself? A Bible still being written. Here's what it does. The world Jesus was born into wasn't a place of settled agreement. It was a landscape of loud, scattered religious debate, each community convinced it held the authentic tradition. The Dead Sea Scrolls weren't the position paper of one faction. They captured the entire argument in all its messy, contradictory detail. And for Scripture itself, this cuts deeper. There was no single universally accepted text of Jeremiah. There were multiple versions, each treated as authoritative by whichever community kept it. Same for Genesis, the Psalms, the prophetic books. Canonization wasn't a finished thing handed down from above. It was still underway, still contested, still unsettled. And now the DNA had proven that physically. Separate communities in separate places were independently keeping separate versions of what each called the Bible. The 2020 publication of this research opened a new chapter in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship, one still being written. Researchers are now expanding the DNA analysis to more fragments and building reference databases of ancient animal DNA from across the region. The goal is a map precise enough that a single fragment could one day reveal roughly where in the ancient world its animal once lived. Written in the skin. So, think about what really happened. For 70 years, brilliant people examined these texts with every tool they had, deciphering ancient scripts letter by letter and reconstructing pages destroyed by time. Real, irreplaceable work. But some questions sat out of reach because handwriting analysis is subjective and comparing parchment by eye is imprecise. Molecular biology offered a completely different way in, one nobody thought to try before that lunch conversation. And what it revealed is bigger than a single archaeological argument. The Dead Sea Scrolls aren't the manifesto of one radical sect hiding from Rome. They're the accumulated sacred literature of ancient Israel itself, gathered piece by piece over generations. Diverse, contested, deeply and messily human. Multiple voices, multiple communities, multiple versions of the Bible, each carried into a cave by someone watching their familiar world come to an end. We only know any of this because scientists finally learned to read a story that was never written in the ink on the surface, but in the DNA of the animals whose skins carried that ink safely through 2,000 years of silence. In 1947, a shepherd's stone broke a clay jar and let an ancient world speak again. In 2020, a geneticist read a sequence pulled from dust in a storage box and heard what had been waiting quietly behind it the whole time. So here's the question I want you to sit with. Do you think these caves held one sect's private library or the rescued scriptures of an entire people? Tell me where you land in the comments. I read them. And if you want more stories where a single overlooked detail rewrites everything we thought we knew, subscribe and stay close, because we're only getting started.